In the final weeks of 2024, Algeria did something no African nation has dared to do in decades. Not with guns, not with protests, but with a single calculated move that hit France where it truly bleeds: its wallet, its pride, and its grip on an entire continent. France thought it had buried the past. Algeria just dug it up, put a price on it, and demanded payment. And what happened next exposed a secret Paris has protected for 60 years. A secret that could unravel French power across Africa forever. This isn't diplomacy. This is revenge, served cold, legal, and devastatingly precise. In the closing weeks of 2024, Algeria made a decision that sent tremors through the halls of power in Paris. Not a military deployment, not a diplomatic protest, but something far more surgical: the systematic dismantling of France's economic, linguistic, and legal grip on Algerian sovereignty. What began as quiet bureaucratic orders soon crystallized into the most comprehensive anti-colonial policy strike launched by any African nation in decades. And France, caught off guard, now faces a question it has avoided for over 60 years. What happens when a former colony stops asking for independence and simply takes it? This is not symbolic politics. This is economic warfare dressed in the language of sovereignty. Algeria has not only challenged French influence, it has weaponized its own legal system, its education infrastructure, and its energy exports to force a reckoning. And the timing is no coincidence. Across the Sahel, from Burkina Faso to Mali to Niger, a new generation of leaders has been severing ties with Paris, shuttering French military bases, and reclaiming control over uranium, gold, and strategic minerals. Algeria's strike is the most advanced iteration of that same impulse, but executed by a state with far greater resources, diplomatic leverage, and economic weight. If France thought it could isolate these uprisings to the fragile post-coup governments of West Africa, Algeria has just proven otherwise. The first blow came through education. In a sweeping directive, Algeria announced the phasing out of French as the primary language of instruction across public schools and universities. In its place, English. Not Arabic alone, as might be expected in a nation where linguistic identity has always been contested, but English, the global language of trade, technology, and diplomacy. The message was unmistakable. French is a relic. English is a gateway. And Algeria intends to orient itself toward a multipolar world, where Paris is no longer the cultural or intellectual center of gravity. For a country where French has dominated elite discourse, bureaucratic systems, and higher education since independence in 1962, this is not reform. This is rupture. But Algeria did not stop at language. It went further, embedding this shift into law. In a legislative move that stunned observers across the continent, Algeria's parliament passed a bill criminalizing the glorification of French colonial rule. The law defines such glorification as a crime against humanity, punishable by fines and imprisonment. It applies not only to public statements, but to academic work, media content, and cultural production. In effect, Algeria has made it illegal to speak favorably of the colonial period, to frame it as development, modernization, or civilizing mission. This is a direct assault on the narrative France has carefully constructed over decades, a narrative that admits to excesses, but refuses to label colonialism itself as criminal. And Algeria named names. The law explicitly references the massacres at Sétif and Guelma in 1945, where French forces killed tens of thousands of Algerian civilians following protests on Victory in Europe Day. It references the use of torture, the forced displacement of rural populations, the scorched earth campaigns of the 1950s, and the nuclear tests France conducted in the Sahara well into the 1960s, contaminating land and communities that still bear the scars. By codifying these events into law, Algeria has transformed historical memory into legal fact. And in doing so, it has stripped France of the ability to control the story. But memory alone does not shift power. Money does. And this is where Algeria's strike becomes truly destabilizing. The government issued a formal ultimatum to French corporations operating on Algerian soil. Relocate your headquarters to Algeria, submit to full financial transparency, and operate under Algerian law or leave. No exceptions. No grace period. The targets are clear. Total Energies, the French energy giant with deep ties to Algeria's oil and gas sector. Renault, which assembles vehicles in Algeria and exports them across North Africa. Telecommunications firms, pharmaceutical companies, infrastructure contractors. All of them are now under pressure to choose, comply, or lose access to one of Africa's largest economies. This is not about taxation. This is about sovereignty over capital. For decades, French companies have operated in Algeria under arrangements that allowed profits to flow back to Paris with minimal reinvestment, minimal local employment at senior levels, and minimal accountability to Algerian regulators. The new rules dismantle that model entirely. Headquarters must be on Algerian soil. Decision-making must involve Algerian executives. Profits must be subject to Algerian oversight. And contracts signed during the colonial era or in the immediate post-independence period under French-dominated frameworks are now up for renegotiation or outright cancellation. Nowhere is this more explosive than in the energy sector. Algeria is one of the world's top exporters of natural gas, much of it piped directly into Europe through undersea infrastructure that terminates in Spain and Italy. For years, France has benefited from preferential pricing agreements, colonial-era contracts that locked Algeria into selling energy below global market rates in exchange for vague promises of partnership and development aid. Those contracts are now being torn up. Algeria has announced that oil and gas will be sold at full international prices, with no discounts, no legacy deals, and no special consideration for historical ties. And payments previously accepted in euros must now be made in Algerian dinars. This last detail is critical. By demanding payment in dinars, Algeria is asserting monetary sovereignty. It is forcing France, and by extension Europe, to engage with Algeria's central bank, to hold Algerian currency, and to recognize that energy security runs through Algiers, not Paris. It is a calculated inversion of the colonial economic logic that kept African currencies pegged to European systems and African resources priced in European terms. And it exposes a vulnerability France cannot easily resolve. Europe needs Algerian gas, especially as Russian supplies remain constrained. Algeria knows this, and it is using that leverage with precision. France, predictably, has responded with hesitation. Publicly, officials in Paris have downplayed the measures, calling them internal reforms, and expressing confidence that dialogue will resolve tensions. Privately, however, panic is setting in, not because Algeria's economy is large enough to cripple France directly, but because the precedent is. If Algeria succeeds in forcing French multinationals to relocate, in repricing energy exports, in criminalizing colonial nostalgia, what stops Senegal from doing the same? What stops Ivory Coast? What stops Morocco, historically France's most reliable partner in the Maghreb? The domino effect is not hypothetical. It is already in motion. In Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré has expelled French troops, shut down French-language media outlets accused of spreading disinformation, and declared that the country's gold mines will no longer be exploited by foreign firms without majority Burkinabe ownership. In Mali, the junta has seized assets belonging to Canadian and French mining companies, accusing them of tax evasion and environmental destruction. In Niger, uranium contracts with France's Orano are under review, and there is growing political pressure to halt exports entirely until terms are renegotiated. These are not isolated tantrums. These are coordinated assertions of resource sovereignty, and Algeria's strike provides them with a legal and economic blueprint. What makes Algeria's approach particularly potent is that it does not rely on populist rhetoric or revolutionary slogans. It relies on law. Every measure, language reform, criminalization of colonial apologia, corporate relocation mandates, contract renegotiations, is grounded in legislation passed through Algeria's parliament. This is not a military coup imposing emergency decrees. This is a functioning state using its legal system to rewrite the rules of engagement. And that makes it far harder for France to dismiss or destabilize. There is also a generational dimension at play. Algeria's leadership, while still dominated by figures with ties to the independence struggle and the military establishment, is increasingly attuned to a younger population that does not remember French rule firsthand, but has inherited its consequences. A population that speaks Arabic and Tamazight at home, consumes global media in English, and sees French not as a language of opportunity, but as a language of submission. For this generation, the question is not whether Algeria should challenge France, but why it took so long. And they are watching Traore. The 35-year-old leader of Burkina Faso has become a symbol of uncompromising sovereignty across Francophone Africa, a figure who rejected the polite fictions of Francafrique and dared France to respond. His speeches, delivered in military fatigues and broadcast across social media, framed the struggle not as anti-Western, but as anti-exploitation. He does not call for isolationism. He calls for partnership on equal terms. And when France refused, he acted. Algeria's moves echo that logic, but with the institutional weight of a state that has existed far longer, accumulated far more leverage, and possesses far more economic clout. But this is not just about France. This is about what comes after France. Algeria is not severing ties with Europe. It is repositioning itself within a multipolar order where China, Russia, Turkey, and Gulf states are all competing for influence. By switching to English in education, Algeria signals openness to Anglophone markets and tech ecosystems. By demanding dinars for energy, it signals alignment with emerging financial architectures that bypass the euro and the dollar. By criminalizing colonial glorification, it signals that African dignity is non-negotiable, and that any future partnership must begin with accountability for the past. France, for its part, has few good options. It cannot afford to lose access to Algerian energy, especially with winter approaching and European gas supplies precarious. It cannot afford to see French multinationals humiliated and forced to comply with terms dictated by Algiers. But it also cannot afford to apologize or pay reparations, because doing so would validate every other former colony's demands for the same. The political cost in Paris would be immense. The far right would weaponize it. The center would fracture. And the left, already divided, would struggle to articulate a coherent response. So France stalls. It offers technical dialogue. It proposes working groups. It hints at future investments and renewed partnerships. But it does not apologize. It does not acknowledge crimes against humanity. And it does not agree to reparations. Algeria, in turn, is not waiting. It is implementing each measure incrementally, testing France's resolve, and watching how other African nations respond. And they are responding. In Senegal, civil society groups have begun citing Algeria's legal framework in their own campaigns against French economic dominance. In Tunisia, opposition politicians have called for similar language reforms. In Chad, where French military presence remains significant, there are growing calls for a timeline toward full withdrawal. The narrative is shifting. Where once challenging France was seen as economically suicidal, it is now seen as politically necessary. And Algeria, with its relative stability, its energy wealth, and its historical legitimacy as the site of one of the most brutal anti-colonial wars in modern history, has given that narrative institutional form. This is not the end of French influence in Africa. France still holds currency arrangements with 14 countries through the CFA franc. It still operates military bases in Djibouti, Gabon, and Ivory Coast. It still has deep ties with elites across the continent. But the terms of that influence are being renegotiated in real time, and Algeria has just raised the cost of maintaining the old model significantly. What happens next depends on two variables. First, whether Algeria's economy can absorb the short-term shocks of confrontation. French investment, however extractive, still represents jobs, infrastructure projects, and access to European markets. If Algeria's domestic economy falters, if unemployment rises, if the transition to English in education creates confusion rather than opportunity, the government will face pressure to backtrack. But if Algeria's bet pays off, if it successfully attracts investment from China, Turkey, and the Gulf, if it renegotiates energy contracts on favorable terms, If its population sees tangible benefits, then the model becomes exportable. Second, whether France can contain the fallout. If Paris can negotiate quietly with Algiers, offer symbolic gestures without formal apologies, and maintain access to energy and markets, then the crisis remains bilateral. But if other nations follow Algeria's lead, if the CFA zone begins to fracture, if military bases come under renewed pressure, then France faces a systemic collapse of its African strategy. And that collapse would not just be economic, it would be existential. France's seat on the UN Security Council, its claim to global relevance, its identity as a former imperial power that successfully transitioned to post-colonial partnership, all of that rests on maintaining influence in Africa. Without it, France is just another mid-sized European economy with limited leverage and a shrinking diplomatic footprint. Algeria knows this. Traore knows this. And increasingly, a generation of African leaders and citizens knows this. The language of sovereignty is no longer abstract. It is encoded in legislation. It is enforced through contract law. It is taught in classrooms where French is being replaced by English. And it is priced into every barrel of oil and cubic meter of gas that flows from Algerian fields into European pipelines. This is not a dispute. This is a realignment. And the question is not whether France will adapt, but whether it can afford not to. Because if Algeria succeeds in rewriting the rules of engagement, if it forces France to acknowledge historical crimes, to pay reparations, to accept full economic transparency, then every other former colony will demand the same. And the post-colonial order that has allowed France to maintain outsized influence across an entire continent will not survive that demand. The strike has been launched. The terms have been set. And Paris, for all its diplomatic experience and historical leverage, is discovering that when a nation decides it no longer needs permission to be sovereign, there is very little a former empire can do but watch.